Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Today is the 5th of February. Welcome to episode 6 of the Groovy Podcast with me, Peter Ledbrook.
And me, Ken Cousin.
Hey, so everybody, Ken Cousin is joining me not as an interviewee, but as a co-host. We do have another partner in crime who apparently couldn't make it to this particular episode. But yeah, hi Ken, how are you doing?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I don't know that we could be too many more time zones separate, could we? You're in London, right?
You could be in New Zealand.
That's probably true.
Or somewhere in China. But yes, so it's 7 o'clock in the morning where you are, I gather?
Right. In San Diego, California. So.
Yeah. I don't have much sympathy. I was up at 6 o'clock this morning running in the snow, so... But to be honest, we don't get quite the same sort of snowstorms that you've been seeing in the US recently.
And you also could have chosen not to be running in the snow.
I could, yes. Well, when I left this morning, it wasn't snowing. It turned to snow halfway through. Okay. Anyway, so let's get on to the news items for this week. Last episode, Guillaume live announced on the show the release of Groovy 2.4.0. So the big thing here is the introduction of proper Android support. So I haven't given much, haven't really tried this out much. I tried it with an early milestone. So Ken, I hear you've been actually giving it a go. What are your thoughts of the Android support and any of the other 2.4.0 changes?
Much like you, I'd been waiting until, actually what I was waiting for was Groovy 2.4 to come out, because I knew Cedric had pointed out in his presentation, which I went to at Spring 1.2 GX last year. He made it clear that in order to make the Android support work, you had to have Groovy 2.4, and that was a very early release candidate at that point. So now that 2.40 is out, I guess in the last, week and a half or so, I thought I'd give it a try, and it was remarkably easy, and the best part is how much easier it was than what his blog post made it sound like. I mean, his blog post was working with an early release candidate, and he had to add a lot of different things in order to make it work. Now that 2.4.0 is a release, all I had to do was I made a regular Android app and went into Android Studio and just updated the Gradle builds. So in order to update the Gradle builds, you put in the various dependencies you need, the Gruoid one. I assume that's pronounced Gruoid. Doesn't that make sense?
I think it's Gruid.
Yeah, except that it would make sense. I mean, if it's going to rhyme with Android, you know?
Okay. So there was an interesting discussion on Twitter with Russell Winder, Cedric, and myself, and about exactly how that should be pronounced. I think it's probably going to stay as Gruid. But yes,
that misses the whole pun. I mean, that misses the rhyme. And I remember that Twitter discussion. All right, well, I suppose I'll have to ask Cedric, right? Or, well, at any rate.
Guillaume and Cedric.
Okay, yeah, and Guillaume, right. So, at any rate, I pasted that in, and I updated the repository, and everything just worked. Now, I renamed my source main Java folder source main Groovy. I renamed the generated activity into a activity.groovy instead of .main. And by the way, the other thing I did, which I'd never done before, is they've got a link to that Swiss knife project. The Swiss knife project allows you to do basically dependency injection inside of an Android app, so you don't have to look up all of your widgets, and you don't have to respond. You don't have to write the inner classes for the events. I was going to replace the inner classes with closures, but it turned out I didn't even have to do that, because with the Swiss knife project, you can put in various annotations like @onClick or @view inject view, and it brought them in automatically. So I was able to write a trivial app, just something to make sure that it all worked. And it was so easy to do that I imagine now I can just use Groovy anywhere in my app. Now what I haven't tried doing, and I'm curious about, is whether I can do both Groovy and Java. The implication is that you can, but I haven't tried to mix them yet. Just because, again, sometimes Android wizards generate code, and I wonder if I can just use it as it stands rather than rewriting everything in Groovy that way.
I mean, I assume that it would work absolutely fine. I mean, since it's ultimately just going down to the bytecode, and you've got the normal Groovy to Java interactions.
I would assume so too. I just didn't actually try that part. I just tried to build it purely in Groovy. Of course, Cedric's conference app is online, but I noticed that his code is all in source main Java, and I don't know whether that's going to have to be updated or not. So I did something completely from scratch. It took me 10 minutes to get it up and running, and I was very pleased with it. So this whole, rumored argument that Groovy will be the Swift for Android, at least it has a chance. I mean, it looks like it's a legitimate way to go.
Yeah, definitely. So I called the Google buying the sort of hiring the Groovy guys. So it's definitely I think it's a possibility, as you say. It's not like a definite. I mean, there are all sorts of arguments for and against, like Google supporting any particular language other than Java. So it'd be interesting to see what happens. But
purely a rumor. But that's what podcasts are for.
Exactly. We're just opinion mongers, rumor mongers. That's it, rumor mongers. Right. So yeah, I'm hoping at some point to give the Android support another go. And of course, the Android support comes with the Gradle plugin as well, which I assume is updated for Groovy 2.4.0.
Well, that was the weird part. In fact, it's the Gradle plugin and everything that kind of brings in Groovy. I mean, every Gradle build I've ever written, on a Groovy app has the Groovy dependency in it, just the Groovy core dependency, and this one does not, which feels really strange, because it's brought in through the plugins.
Right, got you. Yeah, but it kind of makes sense.
Sure, but the funny part is that it's like if you go to Android Studio and say, well, I'm going to put in the Groovy plugin for IntelliJ, for Android Studio, it says, no, there's nothing there. And yet, as soon as you add in the Gradle build and it adds all the dependencies, then you're fine. You just don't have any way, you don't have a right-click where you can say, oh, I want a new Groovy class. You have to make a new file, just end the file extension in .groovy, and then it understands the Groovy code inside it without any problem.
Okay, that's interesting. And actually, thinking about it more, it is unusual for a plugin to depend on a language, because then it depends on a specific version.
Right. But I didn't have any problems with things compiling or telling me I was missing dependencies or anything like that. It looked like, as I say, it took about 10 minutes to get it set up. It updated and downloaded all the required dependencies and worked right out of the box. I think now I'm going to actually use it. Now I'm working on a Gradle for Android book on that. Not on that. I'm talking about Gradle for Android, and now I've just came up with a new chapter, right?
Oh, cool. Well, I hope you're making good progress on that.
Hope is a strong term.
Okay, cool. So I just quickly want to move on. So there was just some other things. Android is the big part of the Groovy 2.4.0 release, but there are some other interesting additions. Apparently, a lot of the methods have been moved from collection class to iterable, which means that a lot of stuff that you've been using for collections will actually work with a lot more things than like just the list sets and other things. So hopefully this will make things a lot more consistent. So anything that implements iterable will get like the size method and the various like find all, and other such methods. And another one I noticed was the Groovy shell is getting some love again. So I'm not really a big Groovy shell user myself. I generally go for the Swing UI console.
Right.
But it's great to see some extra love getting there, because the tooling support is nice, and I do use like the Groovy console extensively. So moving swiftly on, Gradle 2.3 release candidate 2 was released just yesterday. So there weren't really many big ticket items that I saw that would be particularly relevant to many people. There was an interesting one. There's an improved Gradle build comparison plugin. I didn't even realize there was one. But this will allow you to kind of either evolve your build or migrate from one build to another and ensure that the stuff that you're generating, the stuff the build is doing, is consistent between like various iterations of a build, or when you're trying to migrate from one build tool to another. So
I have noticed, by the way, that in the Gradle builds these days, they still list it as an experimental feature, but the Gradle init capability, the one that generates the project for you, I've been using that now for several months, and it's worked very nicely. I haven't tried to do it with a Maven POM yet, but just using Gradle init Groovy, Groovy projects or things like that have been very convenient. I hope that makes it into the final version and becomes something that's no longer experimental.
Yeah, I imagine that. I think I've saw something along the lines of that. That's definitely going to be a core feature, and they'll be spending a bit more time on that. Of course, I'm a little bit biased against it because, of course, that competes with Lazybones, my own project. But I think, for anybody that doesn't want an extra tool, just being able to do like Maven archetypes, but better within Gradle is great. So yeah, it's currently an incubating feature, but I can't imagine that will be for that much longer.
Well, I use Lazybones when I do Rat Pack.
Yeah, that was his original intention. It's interesting to see other ones. It's actually good for creating a new Spring Boot app, for example. I'd be interested to see how it fits in with Grails 3 as well, with its new profiles and stuff. But we'll get onto that. In fact, it's the next item. So just to finish off on the Gradle 2.3, there is better Eclipse web tooling platform integration, WTP, I think that's what it stands for. And the tooling API can now generate colored output, just like the command line for Gradle does. That was contributed by Larry Hatari, who is part of the Grails team. So I assume this was connected with Grails 3 because that uses Gradle for its build now. So yes.
That's a topic that was not discussed previously with the end of the pivotal support, is what's going to happen with Groovy and Grails tool suite. I've been worried about that product for months now because it seems like each version is less stable than the previous, even though they keep adding things. And of course, the Gradle support was never really very good. I'm glad to see they're improving the Gradle support in it, and we'll see what happens with Groovy and Grails tool suite. Personally, I'd much prefer to use IntelliJ, but I work with a lot of clients who don't have an IDE budget. They just use the free tools, and so I'm stuck with it sometimes. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves as well.
Yeah, let's come back to that shortly. We're talking about the Grails 3 release, and part of the Grails 3, one of the advantages is the IDE support. So yes, like Grails 3 Milestone 1 was waiting on, as Graham said last time, is waiting on the Gradle 2.3 release. So Grails 3.0 Milestone 1 is now available. Just a couple of notes I've picked up from emails from the dev mailing list. You do want to use the latest patch versions of either Java 7 or Java 8, whichever is your preferred platform. There seem to be some like JVM bugs that affect Grails or perhaps its Spring Boot, so earlier patch versions. So get the latest Java. And it seems like JDK 7, I'm not sure whether it's the minimum for Grails 3 development, but it certainly seems to be the minimum for importing a project into IntelliJ, and possibly Eclipse and GGTS as well. It looks like there's a binary incompatibility with the Asset Pipeline plugin, which is all plugins in Grails 3 are now jar files. They're pre-compiled, so they're classes, so we will run into these kinds of issues where somebody's compiled something against Java 8, and therefore you can't use the plugin in a Java 7 or Java 6 project. So it'll be interesting to see how whether there are any mechanisms to ensure that plugins don't get released with ridiculously recent versions of Java. But it will certainly improve like build speed, and there are a lot of other advantages to using pre-compiled classes. So I haven't had a chance really to try Grails 3 out yet. I've seen Graham's presentations on it. So Ken, I think you watched his screencast at least. I mean, what are your first impressions?
Well, I like the fact that now, of course, it's using Gradle. I think that was the last major project in the whole Groovy ecosystem that still used Gantt, Yeah. And now, of course, it's using Gradle. By the way, his podcast, Graham did a screencast on it that has been referenced in the Groovy Weekly and in Jakob Mikkelson's Gradle's Diary, and that screencast is wonderful. I highly recommend taking a look at that. But when I was looking at it, I liked the Gradle features for it. I liked the standalone mode. I also found it very interesting that now you can do functional tests in Grails, and that it will use Jeb for the underlying infrastructure for that. And up to now, whenever you want to do a functional test in Grails, you had to add a plugin, and now that's going to be built right in and generate a Jeb test for it. I don't know that I care about the YAML configuration stuff. That seemed to be somewhat of an interesting decision. But I
Well,
don't think
the
I've heard it.
advantage of YAML, sorry to interrupt, but the advantage of YAML is that it can be modified programmatically. Well, certainly a lot easier than trying to modify any of the Groovy config files.
Oh,
So
okay.
you're not. I think you're restricted to using YAML in. Actually, no. If I remember the discussion with Graham correctly, you can still use Groovy configuration files. It's just that Grails uses YAML by default. I think you can even define commands using Groovy scripts rather than using the YAML files.
Interesting.
So yeah,
Only
you don't have to deal with YAML directly yourself. You shouldn't have to. I think that's the intention.
I'm not worried about it. I just was surprised to see it. It wasn't something I was expecting, but it doesn't look like it'll be a problem at all. And we have to, give a hat tip to Marco Vermeulen because suddenly Milestone 1 was available on GBM, just like everything else, and GBM is, I think every Ruby developer in existence, a Rails person ought to shake Marco's hand for GBM. So
yeah, definitely. Or buy him a beer every time you see him.
Even better, even better.
So yeah, there are other things like you get the application.groovy file, which means that you can just right-click on that class, go run, and it will launch it in your IDE.
Yeah, similarly, they said that you could generate the war file and then run it from java-jar command, either as a war or a jar file. Again, that's the Spring Boot heritage underneath.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you get a what do they call it? Fat jar, or a fat war in this case. You just get all the dependencies in there and just run it using the Java command. And this goes to, I mean, the other nice thing, you mentioned the functional tests with Jeb. What I find really interesting there is that you can run the functional tests now from within the IDE just by right-clicking on the test case.
And it didn't seem to drive a browser or anything. I mean, it didn't create a browser and watch it for when Graham did it in his screencast, and I have no idea what he's got on that machine, but man, everything runs fast, and it works like a charm, and I didn't see a browser open up and run. It just ran all the tests and worked.
Okay, he may have been using HTML unit, like a headless connector.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I didn't dwell on it long enough to really look at the text.
Yeah, but it means you no longer need to spin up the Grails build in order to run the functional tests. You can just do them. So IDE integration is just a core feature now of Grails, and you basically don't need special Grails support in order to work on a Grails project now, because you just run it as if it's a Java application. You just run the tests as if they are standard JUnit tests. So pretty much everything you needed special tooling support for, you no longer do, which means you can use IntelliJ Community Edition for Grails 3 applications.
Oh boy, I didn't even think of that. That's really good. That's good to hear. That may make a big difference for a lot of clients I know.
So and that may mean that you don't really need that special Grails support in GGTS either. So standard STS should be fine.
Has anybody tried it there yet?
I don't know. Maybe somebody will.
I'm getting to the point where I don't trust it anymore. But when they come out, I assume the final version will be out before, just to pick a random date, the end of March.
Certainly Grails 3 is scheduled for that, yes. STS, I have no idea.
No, I meant Grails 3. So when it comes out in the final version, then I'll try it out in STS. Of course, if we or GTS, if we decide to talk about it in the next podcast, I'll try it before then if you'd like.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I mean, one thing that I'm a little worried about, or something that the Grails 3 really needs right now, a couple of things, are a migration guide. So for getting people from their 2.x projects onto 3.
Yes.
The change to Gradle means that a lot of the build integration stuff, if you've got anything that monkeys around with the build, that has to be changed completely.
Yep.
Custom commands are now handled. The whole command line. The command line is a lot faster. So they've tackled a lot of real pain points with Grails 3. So there's some really significant benefits that will, I think, allow people or encourage people to come back to the framework if they've been put off by some of the things like it's slow to launch the build and launch commands and that kind of thing. So that's fixed. But there really needs to be a migration guide. Otherwise, I don't think many people are going to try the milestones, which means there's not going to be enough feedback. And you need something similar for plugin authors as well, because at the moment, maybe there is something, but I haven't seen it. The most I've seen is, here are some example plugins, the existing Grails 3 plugins. Basically, go through those and have a look to see what changes you might need to make to your own. So I think to encourage plugin authors to update their plugins, there really does need to be some sort of migration guide there as well.
I suspect the top 20 or 30 plugins in popularity, those authors will already be working on this as soon as they can. I mean, those are the ones I trust the most anyway. Is when I go to the Grails site, to the plugins list, and look under popular, and if it's in the top, say 40 or 50, then I have some faith in it. So I'm working hard.
Some are going to be harder to migrate than others. So anything that just does stuff at runtime, I think the mail plugin would be fairly easy to migrate. Anything that integrates with the build system, I think Spring Security is going to be a little bit tricky, as well as the database migration plugin. Anything related to test running, I think, will require a fair bit of work. But at the moment, it's not clear exactly what you need to do and what the changes are. And I kind of hope that there's a plugin API specification, something that plugin authors can work against. And it's something that I always felt sad about with earlier versions of Grails, and something I wish I'd been able to invest time in early on in Grails life. I was working on it around the Grails 1.0 and 1.1. You have the plugin descriptor, but there are all sorts of other things that a plugin could do, but there were no real specifications for it. So it was really a look at what other plugins are doing, and then of course some things break, and so it'd be nice to say this is the plugin API. Even better would be if an application had exactly the same hooks as a plugin. I remember there's a long-running issue, so that, hey, why can't applications hook into do with application context, or do with Spring, or the other ones like do with dynamic methods? Because you sometimes want to do that for an application without having to pull it out into a plugin. So it'd be interesting to see whether anything happens on that score.
You realize how many tasks you're adding to the Grails team now to have to get done before the release?
Yes. I think it's. I mean, I have quite a lot to say, which is part of the reason I haven't done the Future of Grails blog post that I promised. There's quite a lot to say, so I think there's a lot of hope. Grails 3 is doing a lot of good things. I personally think there's still some of these things to encourage people to get more active and make sure that Grails 3 has a good ecosystem of plugins when it comes out. And one of the other advantages of Grails 3 is that so much has been ripped out that the core, like the Grails developers, have much less responsibility. There's a small code base that they're actually directly responsible for.
Okay.
Grails 2, I mean, if you look at how much stuff the Grails core team worked on, including all the plugins, it was a huge amount. I would say just too much for the size of the team. So it's great to see like so much like being ripped out. Like they don't have to worry about the build system anymore. They just rely on the Gradle team to do their stuff.
Wonderful.
There's much less specialized code inside because Spring Boot is doing so much more of the work. Okay. There was a lot of custom Spring configuration at runtime, so that's a big hope for me, is that there's just less work. There's less a smaller code base for the actual core developers to work on.
That'll make it easier for you and Glenn to update Grails in Action again then.
Moving swiftly on. So yeah, now that it's, I think the borders between Spring and Grails will be more cleanly delineated. I think it's going to be easier for people to contribute to the project. But if you're going to have an open source project, there's still, to get people involved, is still a big investment in time and effort. There's no real way to get around that. Unless you're like Node and you have a community that's like millions strong, and then you only need 0.01% of them to actually actively contribute, and hey, your project's sorted.
But the price you pay for that is you've got to like work on Node and write in JavaScript, and it's not worth it.
And the other thing, of course, is that when you've got so many people and like so many modules and that kind of, managing those and making sure that users have a manageable experience.
The only other thing, by the way, that I'm looking forward to in Grails 3 that was not featured yet will be a profile to make just a RESTful web service, something that allows you to strip out all the additional stuff and just be able to build something similar to but different from Ratpack, which, if you want, that may be our segue to talk about Ratpack.
Yeah. So we'll go on to that next. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing, but I don't think that's what a profile will be. So your profile is whether it's like a servlet application or a netty application or a command line application.
Oh, okay. Well, I know that one of the goals that I'd heard all along was in Grails 3, while you can do RESTful web services very easily with the annotations now, it would be nice if you could say, hey, look, I only want a microservice, if you will, to use last year's buzzword. Instead of getting the full massive Spring Hibernate type of support, we get something without necessarily a UI level and a layer and things like that, so that you could just have something that, again, it's similar to but different from the Ratpack type of functionality.
Yeah. So my understanding is that you basically have the servlet profile, and then you will have a project archetype, like a Gradle build project. Right. Which only includes the plugins and other dependencies that you need for a RESTful web service.
Yeah, I'm looking
for that. You just don't include the plugins that you don't want to use. So yeah, I think that's going to be a big advantage. It's going to lower the footprint of a lot of Grails applications. It's going to make it more viable for microservices as well, I think. So the integration with Ratpack is an interesting one. Dan Wood says there's something coming, so I can't wait to hear what he has planned there. So Ratpack has a 0.9.13 release. It's apparently a big one. The team have told us this is a big release. So I had a look at the announcement. The show notes will have a link to the release notes for it. Basically, the way that an application, Ratpack application, starts has changed completely. You don't have this thing called a launch config anymore. You now have an entry point, which is a Ratpack server, which is a concept that I think people will be more familiar with. Will understand that better. And possibly more importantly, the registry mechanism, where like modules were registered for possibly doing like database work or like background threads, that kind of thing. That is now moved outside of request handling. So the idea is that Ratpack will be now much easier to integrate into like application frameworks. So it'd be easier to integrate with a Spring application with just the web front end being Ratpack.
That would be interesting to see. I've used Ratpack off and on over the past couple of years, and I really like the simplicity. But the biggest problem I've always had with Ratpack was the documentation was so far behind the actual functionality that I never really knew how to do anything in it. So I'm hoping that when they hit their 1.0 release, which presumably is coming, that would be one of the major things, is to show us how to use all this stuff and with some examples that we can work from.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a simple one for my website, but yeah, I think there's it's well engineered, but not. I don't feel it's terribly accessible. I've been to several Ratpack talks, and they tend to, if you're not familiar with the terminology, a lot of it just goes over your head. I mean, it's technology-wise, it is really pretty good. It scales very well from people who've actually tried it. And it's
capabilities and the asynchronous stuff and the handler chains. I mean, it's really very impressive technology. We just need to make it a little bit easier to get into.
Yeah, Yeah, so I'm hoping to actually spend some time on Rat Pack at some point and do introductory work, and also like actually I'm thinking of working on the manual as a way to get familiar with Rat Pack itself. So sometimes you just do a whole project using one technology in order to learn about that technology. I think writing about it is another way to do that.
Absolutely, and Dan's still working on his book too, so hopefully the combination will give us lots of ways to get on that.
Yeah, that's going to be great. Every time we meet Dan, we'll be able to ask him about the book. That's going to annoy him so much, so quickly.
I had such a fun time reviewing that proposal because while everything in there was great, the proposed schedule, I just was laughing so hard and thinking, boy, I can't wait to meet him at this next conference. And so, how's it coming? Are you still on schedule?
Oh, yeah. The initial schedules are always quite interesting. I remember ours, and I was like, no, seriously, I don't really want to commit to a schedule because I know it's not going to happen like that. So, yeah, no news on Rat Pack 1.0, but 0913 is a big release. Hopefully there won't be big API changes from now until 1.0, but we don't really know. But, yeah, if you're using Rat Pack and want to give it a try, then definitely check out that release. Another library technology that's got a new release is GrooveScript, which hit a milestone. It hit 1.0. So GrooveScript is a transpiler to take Groovy code and transpile it to JavaScript. So as Guillaume said in one of his tweets, you can now have Groovy on the server and now in the client on the web device in a browser, and you can also have it on Android. So you can have Groovy throughout the whole stack of like modern mobile applications.
Well, now that that's 1.0, I am looking forward to looking at that. I browsed through the manual a little bit, looked at it. I mean, it feels like instead of having to go to CoffeeScript, now you've got Groovy, and that works for me, but I haven't actually tried to use it in an app yet. Presumably you'll be able to add it to a Grails app just through, not even through a plugin, just by adding the proper jars in the proper place. I imagine you'll be able to go ahead and use it there too.
Well, I imagine it would integrate with Asset Pipeline.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, I don't know where the code generation part's done, but once it's generated, I imagine they could just serve it up.
Yeah. That's my understanding, but I don't really know much about that project. It was certainly something like coming from a background of GWT. I was always interested in the idea of using Groovy rather than Java. But it is quite a crowded space. I mean, there's TypeScript and ClojureScript and CoffeeScript, as you mentioned, and others. So it'll be interesting to see how much traction that one gets. And I don't do much in the way of JavaScript anyway, so I can't see myself playing around with that technology, but definitely if you have a go, you'll have to let us know how you find it.
Yeah, I'm not an expert at that either. That's not really my space, but I will. I mean, now that they're 1.0, I feel like I at least ought to give it a try and see how it works. But yes, you're right. That is a big space, and there's a lot of people who write JavaScript and just live with it, and there's a lot of people who go to any lengths possible to avoid writing JavaScript, and this is a good one.
Yeah. I do hope that people give it a try. I think it'd be, especially if you have a Java or Groovy background, then it's probably the easiest one for you to pick up. So that's GrooveScript. We mentioned books. We've mentioned several books. Of course, the big one that people are still waiting for is Groovy in Action 2nd edition, and the news is it has gone to production. So you won't be getting it.
But did you see how subtly that was announced? I mean, Dirk sends something saying, "Oh, Regina, however you prefer to say it, went into production." Didn't even say the name of the book. For those listeners who are not familiar with that term, Groovy in Action was always abbreviated as Gina, as in I've spent many a pleasant evening with Gina, And then, of course, the 2nd edition was always going to be known as Regina, which also apparently is Paul King's mother's name. So that works out.
Right. I did not know that.
Yeah, he told me that. So, of course, that was always the joke, that it was going to be Regina. And he didn't even come out, Dirk didn't come out and say, "Oh, we sent Groovy in Action 2nd edition to publication." He just said Regina. And you had to catch that and go, "Oh, wait, hey, this is big news. We've been waiting, I think the 1st edition's 2007 maybe, 2008 at the latest. And we've been waiting ever since for the 2nd edition." That's still, by the way, that first edition, still my favorite all-time technical book. I love that book. So I'm really looking forward to the second edition. Even though all the chapters have been ready and available at Manning, you know what sorts of changes they undergo when you do the final production run and get in all the feedback and everything. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the final version looks like.
Yeah, this will only be big, I know that much. 1,000 pages, apparently.
Yeah.
600 code listings. So, yeah, it's a magnus opus.
But it's a definitive guide, you know. I mean,
yeah, it is pretty much.
Hold all the answers in it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know when people will get it through the letterbox, but hopefully, you know, a couple of months, maybe something like that.
Right.
We shall see. But yes, many people have been waiting a long time for it, and they've I don't know how many Groovy versions they've gone through.
I don't know that they delineated them. I think the thing kind of stagnated off and on, and they'd add another co-author, and they'd write this 1 or 2 chapters, and then, you know, I remember when they added Hamlet Darcy, for example, to do a couple of more chapters, and then again it would kind of wait. But, I mean, I can't imagine if I had to deal with that book and to sit down and say, all right, now I've got to go through this entire thing and give it a common look and feel and smooth out all the variations and rewrite it. It would be a mountain. I'd just be so intimidated I wouldn't even want to start. So I understand why it took a long time. I'm just really happy that we're finally going to have it in the next couple of months.
Yeah, it is very good news. A lot of people waiting for that. Good for Groovy as well. Good for the language to have that reference finally up to date. So just want to finish off with Spring 1.2 GX was announced. So it will be the 14th to the 17th of September 2015. There will still be the usual 4 tracks on Groovy and Grails, and it will be in Washington, D.C. again.
Right.
So I really enjoyed the one at Washington, D.C. I like Washington, D.C. as a city. It's kind of, I didn't really expect a federal capital to be a nice place, but actually it's quite nice.
Whereas for me, that's, I guess, more or less routine. It's also one of the few places I can actually fly direct, so I like that too. But yeah, it's a very good location for a conference. I like the fact they've done this East Coast, West Coast, other type of cycle. You know, last year in Dallas and the previous year in San Jose, and it's time to come back to the East Coast and put it in DC again. I think that'll work out very nicely. Yeah, looking forward to that one. So yeah, I think we're going to wrap this up. I will hopefully get on the blogging platform again and blog my thoughts on the future of Grails. I do, you know, my thoughts are with the Groovy and Grails teams as they're, like, I suspect still trying to negotiate support for the project, sponsorship for the project. So fingers crossed there. And I'm sure we'll have good news by March. Right. The implication that seemed to come out of their discussions was that there's a lot going on they can't talk about. There's a lot of discussions happening behind the scenes, and we really won't know anything concrete until it actually happens, and presumably that will be sometime in March. Yeah, exactly. So in the meantime, we'll just have to keep groovying along. We've got plenty to get our teeth into, especially with the Grails 3 release and Groovy 2.4.0 and the Android stuff. So have fun with all that stuff, guys, and I will get this up and audio version as soon as I can with show notes, which will have links to a lot of these announcements for you. So until next time, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Take care.